Hello, everyone, and welcome to Language Development. It's an honor to be working with you all. I know we're going to have a great semester, and so hopefully these PowerPoints are helpful in which I narrate them, if you will. But if they're not, just let me know and we can change the format a little bit. So, first, I wanted to quickly introduce myself. So, if you look at the top left, you'll see the Six Flags Dallas Cowboys Stadium and the Texas Rangers Stadium. And so it's the Arlington, Texas skyline, and that is actually where I grew up. I finished K through 12 there, and then later, eventually, I came back and taught there. I taught 9 years for the Arlington Independent School District. I was a bilingual teacher. Both I taught third grade for 7 years and second grade for 2 years. Taught all subjects at different times. Sometimes I specialized in reading and writing. Sometimes I specialized in math and science. It depended on the year and what they needed. If you go down to the bottom right corner, you'll see the Blue Devil. That's where I actually went to undergraduate school. That's where I got my bachelor's degree. So I moved from Arlington, Texas to Durham, North Carolina. It was a pretty interesting transition, but I really enjoyed my time there. I actually didn't study education. I wasn't a traditional teacher candidate like many students who end up becoming teachers. I actually studied political science and Spanish, and I ended up getting my alternative certification the summer after I graduated. But what was notable, about my time at Duke was that I spent a year in Quito, Ecuador, and that's when I became fully bilingual. I'm not a native Spanish speaker, so I developed my Spanish abilities by studying abroad in Quito, Ecuador. But also, I had an opportunity to volunteer for a year teaching at a Native American school there. And so I taught at a trilingual school that taught primarily in Spanish and Quechua, the native language, but also I helped develop a fledgling English language program. And so that was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, and that's actually what compelled me to decide to be an educator, was my time there. If you look at the bottom left, the big A, that is where I did my master's degree. So while I was teaching during the day, and also I would teach at night, I would teach adults from my district, adult ESL and adult GED classes for those who are trying to get their high school equivalency. So while I was doing that, both working full time and doing kind of a second job, I also pursued my master's degree at the University of Texas at Arlington. I got it in uh, educational administration and policy, and my focus was on dual language programs. And so for part of that program, we got to go to Spain, and it was almost like a half-paid trip, so that was nice. But it was for administrators or people who are interested in school leadership that were bilingual and also wanted to learn about how to implement dual language programs. If you look at the top right with the big V, the gold and black V, is Vanderbilt. That's where I pursued my doctorate degree, and I recently got it in 2017. I was also going full time as a teacher and working in the evenings. But on the weekends, about once every month, I would go to Nashville, Tennessee. I would fly up there and stay with family who lived there. And on the weekends, I would take classes in person at Vanderbilt. And so those were interesting times. So the next slide just kind of gives a summary of what I just said. There might be a few more pieces of information. I also had like a Saturday job where I worked and tutored at a Korean academy for Korean American students who are ESL learners. And so I helped tutor them in SAT, ACT, college writing, anything K through 12 related. I even tutored them in some math. And so that was a nice experience because I got to understand a whole new system of education. The Korean educational system is very different than the United States system. And so through being in a school that kind of bridged both educational systems, that kind of took the best of both or mixed both, I learned a lot from that experience. And then at the top, you of course see the WT symbol, and I'm very honored to be a new tenure track faculty at WT. I've met countless students, and I hope that we'll get to interact a lot through email and through other forms of communication. And I've really had a wonderful experience interacting with the students. They're very engaged. It's impressive how they are able to juggle family commitments and career commitments. And so it's an honor to be able to work with you and to be your professor. Okay, so on this slide, please ignore it. It was a remnant from another class, but we are not doing a hybrid structure. We are doing all online since I'm not really sure where all of you guys are located, but I'd like to find out. That's what hopefully we will learn in the discussion boards and the reading response boards on WG Class or Blackboard is another way to call it. So our class is all online, but I really want to make it a personable and interactive experience. I want us to engage in active learning and to collaborate and to learn from each other. I know I can learn just as much from you as you all can learn from me. And so, as professionals and graduate students, I hope that we will have continual and rewarding dialogue throughout the class. Here are some of my expectations. In terms of the top one where it says attendance and participation, by attendance, it's just turning in your assignments on time, responding to your colleagues' reading responses and their discussion board postings. You only have to write about 50 words for each person, but as long as you are participating in the discussion, that is your attendance and participation. Mutual respect, I don't know if I put in this part, but we might have disagreements and different theories or philosophies on education and bilingual education, but we can all have a very positive phrasing of our arguments and make sure that we're enacting tolerance in everything we do and respect. And so if you do disagree with someone, you're welcome to disagree with their argument or with their point of view, but please do not go to disagreeing with the person themselves. Do not assume that because a person thinks a certain way means that their personality or their characteristics are that way. So basically, no ad hominem arguments. Don't attack the person, attack the argument if you choose to disagree. Some of you maybe will agree with each other, or we'll learn from each other, or we'll maybe negotiate what our prior understandings from what we've learned from our colleagues. But regardless, if you do disagree, criticize the idea, not the person. Another expectation is that I want all of the assignments turned in on time. Now, there is a caveat to that. I know that you all are busy professionals juggling family and career, and so I understand that. And for that reason, I do accept late assignments. If the assignment is within an hour or two, or even probably the next morning, I probably won't consider it late. But if it's a day or two after the deadline, at that point, I will take 20 points off the assignment. And so the danger of turning in late assignments is that you don't have a chance to get as much feedback. I can't guarantee that I'll give you verbal or written feedback if it's a late assignment. Also, you will get 20 points off your total grade, so the best grade you can get is an 80. And then furthermore, your ability to correct your work, which is a large part of this class, will be diminished because I can't guarantee that I'll return the grade in time for you to correct your assignment. Moreover, you might not have complete feedback if you turn in your assignments late, so you might not know how to correct your assignment. Finally, I don't take any grades after December 4th at 11:59 p.m. That's to ensure that I have time to grade all of your assignments before the final grades are due. So going back into it's not necessarily put here on the PowerPoint, but going back to the idea of correcting your work, I'm a firm believer in and improvement and continual improvement and learning from your mistakes or learning from feedback. And so I look forward to hearing your feedback in terms of the class and the lesson structure and everything. But also, I'll be giving you feedback on your writing and on your ability to convey the arguments or the positions that we discussed in the class, and how you can relate them to your personal experiences. And when I give you feedback, it will, of course, be positive and constructive. But at the same time, it gives you the opportunity to correct your assignments. You can get almost full credit back. I believe I said the highest grade was a 90, but I'll double check the syllabi in a little bit. But you can get almost a full credit if you do your corrections. It's either a 90 or 95. If you turn in your assignments on time and you do a very good job in your corrections, I'm sure I can give you up to a 95. So almost you can get basically full credit for doing your corrections and doing a good job of improving. And so taking that feedback and growing as a student, as an academic, and as a professional, that will be a way that you can assure that you'll do well in this class. So if you are ever stuck or worried about time, you feel time pressure, please do your best to turn in something. That way that I can give you the feedback and corrections, and then you can use that feedback to make corrections and get almost full credit. All right. Finally, the next expectation, your work should be your own words. You should never copy and paste. If you quote an author, you must put the author's name and put the page number and later cite that source. But you really shouldn't be quoting. I mean, maybe once in every assignment, or maybe maximum twice for one of the long assignments, like the final paper, should you be using quotes. And your quotes should maybe be only 1 or 2 sentences long. They really shouldn't take up a lot of meat of your paper. The majority of your paper should be either summarizing or paraphrasing what you've read in our text, or also later when you're doing the analysis section, when you're connecting it to what you already know, your schema, your prior knowledge, and your experiences. At that point, you're using your own completely original ideas and of course, completely original language. Once again, if you summarize or paraphrase or quote, you have to cite your source. I have given the APA or MLA site. I gave the APA version of the citations in the syllabus, and so you can use that as your guide, or you can use MLA format. Either way is fine. Just use one citation. And sorry, my dog was barking, if you heard that. So you just have to cite in some way. And, if you make a small mistake in citation in terms of putting the author's name before, first name first instead of last name, that's not a big deal. The fact that you're attempting and you're trying your best to do your citation to the best you know how, I'm not incredibly nitpicky, but you do need to cite other people's works because that shows respect to their ideas and their hard work. It's kind of like if I wouldn't like it if I was a teacher if I spent the whole year working very hard and then someone came in and took credit for my student's achievement. So that's kind of like what happens when you use someone else's ideas and someone's research or points of view, and even if you paraphrase or you summarize what they're saying, you still need to attribute their name to their original idea. So regardless of quoting, summarizing, or paraphrasing, you need to cite, and you can use either APA or MLA format. So let's look at the assignments. So first we have the weekly reading response. The weekly reading response is going to be I gave you the due dates on the syllabus. They won't be hard for you to follow that. But I will post a link to the reading response. I believe that they've already been posted, but on WT class. And if you have issues, you can always email me them. But eventually I'll try to help work with you to post it in the right position in WT class. For your weekly reading responses, I want you to not only summarize, so that's the first part, summarize the week's readings, but I also want you to reflect and analyze what they say. So I want you to consider, do you agree with the readings? Does that fall in line with your experiences? Did you learn something new from those readings? what do you think the author had correct? What did the author need to improve upon? Also, maybe think about how you could employ the lessons or the theories from the readings into your classrooms or into your jobs. And so that's the analysis section. You want to have about an equal amount of summary and analysis. If your summary is slightly longer, that's fine. I always liked to have a really thorough summary when I was a student. So the minimum requirement is 500 words. And then since we have a small class, I put respond to 2 classmates. But since we have only 4 students in the class right now, we might have more. I would very much appreciate and give the top marks and maybe even extra credit for those who reply to all students. So not just 2 classmates, but to reply to all of your students. And in your response, please have them at least 50 words long, and for each response. And once again, respond to the ideas, not the person, and try to make them substantive in nature. Don't just and I don't think this will be an issue in this graduate class or master's class, but don't just, say, oh, I'm only from this city, or, it needs to be a little bit more substantive than that. So the next assignment is the interview of a bilingual person or second language learner. And there's the due date right there. It's 15% of the grade. There's 2 parts to this assignment. First thing to notice is that for a bilingual person or second language learner, that could be many different types of people, right? For the most part, most people in the United States have been second language learners at one time. They learned a language in high school or in college. Ideally, this assignment would be interviewing someone who's completely bilingual or who has developed a pretty significant bilingual ability. But if you are having trouble finding that kind of person, then finding someone that is an incipient or beginning bilingual person, or someone who has kind of a minimal amount of second language acquisition, is okay. So you're going to interview them, and you're going to ask them questions about how is it like to learn the second language, what did they struggle with, what was beneficial for them, what were the effective teaching strategies they thought were the most beneficial, and what areas or what teaching strategies or difficulties seem to be obstacles in their way. And then you want to also find out about how they use their second language and what target or what group of people they interact with in that second language, and also in what context or domain. So what situation do they use that language? And we'll talk about that later in the PowerPoint. And we'll also go over the each part, the Valdez continuum. We'll do that later today in class. And we'll also go over the language targets and language context. So just stay tuned to the rest of the PowerPoint, and it'll explain a little bit more about what you're going to be doing with this interview. Okay, the next assignment is an extra credit assignment, especially since many of you might be, telecommuting or whatever you call it, wireless commuting, where you're coming from other cities or even other states. So this is totally optional. It's extra credit. I'll let you look at it, but it's the WT does a big Dia de los Muertos event on campus. And so if you would like to participate in that, please email me or let me know, and I can give you more information. But this is some of the basic dates. You would set up an ofrenda. Ofrenda is like an offering where you pay tribute and show your respect and your memories of someone who's passed on. And so you remember them through pictures or through things that maybe objects they used to use or their former clothes or anything you have to remember them. And so if you make this ofrenda, you can get up to 10 major points on a major assignment. And then if you even show up to the event, which is on October 26th from 5 to 7 p.m., it's free, and it's at the Panhandle Museum in Canyon, Texas, on the WT campus. If you show up to the event, you'll get another 10 points on a major assignment. Let's go into the next major assignment, which is the timeline of language acquisition. In this class, we are going to read several different texts, and I included them on Blackboard. There's the 3rd edition of the textbook, which you can, of course, use, but I can't guarantee that all the chapters match up with the 5th edition, which is the one I'm using on my syllabus and in my lectures. But you are welcome to use the older edition, the Baker 3rd edition. I posted that in WT class, and I also posted the other 2 books, which are digital books, in the WT library, so you shouldn't have trouble accessing them. You might have to log in and put in your screen name and password or whatever for WT, but then after that you should have access. If you have trouble accessing those texts, please let me know. So this assignment with the timeline of language acquisition, you're going to both write down and show a visual of the steps and the order in which people learn a second language. And so when you're writing down the steps or the order or the sequence in which people are learning a language and the timeline in terms of the number of years it takes, for example, you can assume that the person is like many of our bilingual students or English language learners. They have a native language at home that they've been exposed at birth, and then when they start to go to school, that's when they really get exposed to their second language. And then also for this assignment, you can assume that the person eventually becomes fully bilingual in both languages. Okay? And that will help you. And then you're going to make a visual representation of this. It could be a PowerPoint, timeline, Prezi. You could draw a poster and just take a picture of it and show it to me. But you also have to have a written explanation of the different steps or the order in which people learn a second language. And the requirement is 500 words. All right. The next major assignment is the literature review. It's a brief one. I want you to find 3 scholarly articles on the topic of bilingual or ESL education. They need to be peer-reviewed, and they should be significantly large in length, so at least 10 pages in length for each article. So you can't read like a quick book review or something. I want a real research article or research paper. And this assignment's going to have 2 parts. You're going to have the article summary and then the analysis. So let's go to each one. For the article summary, for each article, I want you to summarize it, but not just summarize the main points, but I also want you to summarize the main aspects of a literature paper. So think about the context, the setting, so in what school district or in what school system or what kind of learners were involved. The population is kind of going in line with that too. Who took part in the study, the research questions, what they were trying to find out or discover, and then their key findings and conclusions. Each summary should be 400 words for each of the articles. So the summary aspect in all should be 1,200 words. The next section should be your analysis. So for each article, I want you to consider your opinion of the article. So do you agree with the article and its findings? Why or why not? How could you use this article in your daily practice as an educator? How do these articles interact with each other? Do they seem to show a common theme, or do they seem to kind of contrast in their points of view or in their findings? And so what's the relationship between the different articles that you found? All right, and the analysis section should be 400 words long. And that's not 400 words each, that's 400 words total. So your analysis can also be an overall analysis of all 3 articles and how they compare and how they contrast. All right, so the next part will be the final paper. The final paper also has 2 parts. The first part is where you're going to describe at least 6 different bilingual and ESL programs. In this course, we're going to discuss about the major types of bilingual and ESL programs in the United States, and we'll also compare and contrast their benefits, their population they have of students, the goals, the outcomes that normally happen, and the bilingual theories behind them. So you're going to kind of conceptualize and summarize what we've learned in class and through the readings to describe these at least 6 different bilingual and ESL programs. The best papers will have more than that, but at least 6. And then once again, you see the different things I'm looking for: purpose, who are the participants, the goals of each program, what normally happens with the usual outcomes, and their perspective of bilingualism. So, additive bilingualism is the idea that learning more than one language is beneficial, and that the idea that you want to learn and maintain your first language, your native language, while you're learning your second language. Subtractive is a little different. That's where your concept is that um, you can remember or not your first language. That's nice, but the main goal is to learn the dominant language. So in the United States, the theory would be for subtractive programs, which I don't necessarily agree with at all. But the subtractive mindset is that, well, if the students learn English in the end, that's fine. Now, if they remember, that's the most important thing if they learn English. If they remember Spanish, that's nice and that would be cool, but that's the goal of the school system is not necessarily for them to end with being fully bilingual in Spanish. The main goal is for them to be completely fluent and successful in English. Then the next part of the assignment is a case study. So the case study has two different situations. I gave you two different cases of the types of English language learners we might see in a school district, and they have different situations and different circumstances, and you're kind of like a consultant for the district. So you're going to advise those parents on what school or what kind of bilingual or ESL program those students should attend. And you're going to have to give reasons why. And so the reasons why will be from the literature and the course readings and the discussions. So basically, which program will be the most beneficial for those two people for their unique situations. So the summary aspect was 750 words of the at least six different bilingual programs. The case study part should be 500 words for each recommendation. So each student, so when you write the recommendation for student A, it's going to be 500 words. So you write the recommendation for student B, it's also another 500 words. Okay, so now let's get into content a little bit. So first, I wanted to define what is an English language learner in the United States. Although this class could be taken in a different direction, in the sense it could be like language development internationally, the majority of our class will be in the context of the United States. So when we consider language learning, we're a little different than Europe. Europe is really promoting multilingualism and learning several different languages. The United States, we do promote learning another language and a foreign language in high school or maybe earlier, but it's not always the main emphasis in our educational system. So what will be most useful for this class for me as an educator is not necessarily geared toward educators of foreign languages, but educators who have English language learners in their classroom who have another native language besides English and are acquiring their second language, which is English. And so focusing on that, defining an English language learner, it's someone who has a native language that is other than English. So at home, they primarily speak a different language than what is spoken in school, English. Second, another definition of an English language learner is someone who is formally participating in an ESL or bilingual educational program. So if you think about it, all students 0 through 4 or 0 through 8 or whatever, depending on what theory you pick, are learning English. So even when I was 2, I was still learning English, even though the only language I heard as a kid was English. I was still learning and developing my English. So technically, if you didn't define English language learner as someone who participates in ESL and bilingual programs, that would mean that I would have been an English language learner, and that's not really what the goal is of this definition. The goal is to not just identify people who are making that huge cognitive effort to learn a second language, but also to recognize their achievements and the struggles that they have to work for and what we as educators can serve them for. And so in this class, we define an English language learner as someone who participates in ESL or bilingual programs. For example, my nephew, even though his parents speak only Spanish, he is not classified an English language learner because he took the language survey in pre-K and scored high enough in on the English section to be in monolingual all English classes. So he's not part of that system. He doesn't have to do TELPAS. His abilities were high enough based on the fact that he heard English from his older brother. He heard English from television and video games. And also when he went to daycare, he heard English from these other students. And so that ended up being enough so that he wouldn't need bilingual or ESL supports. So technically, he's an English language learner because his first language is not English, it was Spanish. But for the definitions of this class, he is not an ELL student that we're talking about because he's not formally participating in those programs. Okay, let's quickly go through the background, the data. As you can see, the United States has a significant number of English language learners, about 10%. In Texas, it's double, it's about 20%. If you look at it, the vast majority speak Spanish as the home language, although we do have significant populations that speak other languages, which you can see. And then something that's interesting is that most English language learner students are not newcomers. They were born here and they're U.S. citizens. So one issue that many districts are dealing with is how can we ensure that our English language learners who grew up in U.S. schools, who have years in U.S. schools, how can we assure that they are progressing in their English ability so that when they're in high school, they're still not in the ESL program, but they're in the regular mainstream educational program. Okay, so let's look at the data. And as an educator, you probably already know or have seen this before, but let's talk about the achievement gap. So achievement gap signifies the difference between the top performing groups and the lowest and lower performing groups. And so in this case, we're using the achievement gap between all students and ELL students. And as you can see, there's about 20 percentage point difference, or 18 percentage points exactly in Texas. So ELLs perform about 18% lower than all students on the STAR. And then if you look at Amarillo and Canyon area where WT is located, it's even worse. It's 20% below how all students perform. If you look at graduation rates, it's also a sad picture in that the majority, especially in our region or Amarillo Canyon, it's nearly 30% difference in graduation rates between native speakers and English language learners. Native English speakers and English language learners. And then if you look at the little star, another thing that's sad is look at the dropout rate. It's double for English language learners. And it's not just because people are leaving to work because they're new immigrants and their parents need someone to earn a living. As we talked about in the prior slide, the vast majority of the English language learners in the U.S. are native born. So they've been in our schools. So they're leaving school, and not some of them are leaving school. The vast majority are not leaving school, but some of them, and at a greater rate than all students on average, some of them are leaving school for other reasons. Maybe they feel like they're not getting enough support from their teachers. Maybe they're struggling academically. Maybe there's other different issues on hand. So we'll talk about that in this class, but I think it's very important to always have that in our minds that we are trying to improve and eliminate basically this achievement gap so that all students can learn and all students succeed at equal levels and at high levels. We don't like to see it where nearly 5% of students are dropping out. That's the number we really want to get almost to zero or to zero. That's what I would hope. The next set, we're not going to talk too much about global bilingual programs and global trends in bilingual or ESL education, but I just wanted to show you, if you look at this, the dark blue is the first language spoken, the native language, the number of native speakers, and then the light blue is the second language speakers. So it's an interesting trend. The vast majority of native speakers, or not the vast majority, but the language that has the most native speakers is Chinese or Mandarin. But if you think of second language speakers, um, the largest amount of people are wanting to learn English as their second language, and they use English as a second language. So technically, English is still the international language, even though Chinese is getting pretty close, as you can see. Okay, this is just if you want to click on that slide, share presentation, it's kind of an interesting presentation of the trends in languages spoken in the United States. But if you see right here, about 20% speak a language other than English in their homes, and most of those languages are Spanish, but then there is a significant amount that are Chinese speakers as well. And then you see other different languages, like Tagalog is the language of the Philippines, and Vietnamese. I know in Arlington we had a large Vietnamese population, so that was more like 5 to 10% of our language spoken in Arlington. Okay, now we're on to a different slide about the foreign languages actually studied by U.S. students. So these are people who were in K through 12 schools throughout their lives, and then in high school or in college they decided to study a foreign language, a second language. So we can assume that they're most likely native English speakers, and this is the second language or third language they've learned. And this is what they've been deciding to focus on in the school setting. And if you look, most students do study Spanish, and then next is French, and then German, and then you also have a group that speaks the like Latin. Very few people are learning Chinese and Japanese, even though we looked at the prior slide, and Chinese is one of the most developing and important languages internationally, and also nationally as well. It's the third most spoken language in the United States. So going to that slide, we're not going to really have time to have a back and forth question and answer, two-way question and answer, but I posed a couple questions on the bottom. Do you think there's a disconnect between what is spoken internationally in the world and also what is spoken in the United States and what our students are actually deciding to study in high school? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? So obviously there's a disconnect, right? There's very few people who are learning Chinese, like I said earlier, even though Chinese is a very common language internationally, the second most common language spoken by first and second language speakers combined. And it's the third most spoken language in the United States. So obviously there is some kind of disconnect. Very few people learn Vietnamese. That's one of the fourth or fifth most spoken languages in the United States. And also there's almost 100 million Vietnamese speakers in Vietnam. So arguably there's more people that speak Vietnamese than, not arguably, but the data shows that more people speak Vietnamese than French in the United States. And so possibly more students should be studying Vietnamese if you think about practicality. Now it depends though where they're going to travel and where they're going to live. But this is just to show you that sometimes our language policies in terms of second language do not always correspond with economic and political need. For example, political need, Arabic, has become more and more important in terms of politics and foreign policy, and so very few, I don't even think they have it on here on this graph, of people learning Arabic in K through 12 schools, although that's becoming more and more necessary and for international policy and foreign policy discussions. Okay, so this is just a graph showing about Texas. So in most major cities, overall in Texas, more than 30%, about more than a third of the population speaks a language other than English at home. And if you see that in some of the metro areas like in Bexar, which is San Antonio, it's closer to almost 50% of the population speaks a language other than English at home. On the right side, you see the number of speakers. So there's more than 10 times as many speakers of Spanish than Vietnamese, which is our second most spoken language in Texas. But Spanish has nearly 7 million speakers in Texas. Vietnamese has 200,000. You can see the rest. But there's a huge difference in terms of quantity of Spanish speakers versus the other languages. If you combine the next 9 languages combined, you would still you'd be close to a tenth of what the total population that speaks Spanish is in Texas. So, in my opinion, Spanish is obviously a very useful language to learn. I'm not saying it's the only language to learn. There's many benefits of learning several different languages, or learning a variety of languages, not just one or two as foreign languages. But if you can look at, in terms of numbers, Spanish seems to be very useful in Texas. Okay, this slide might not be as meaningful for those who are out of towners, but this is Randall County, which is where Canyon and Southern Amarillo is, and that's where our WT campus is. And as you can see, even in Canyon, there's a significant amount of language diversity, probably about 10%, 15%. And then, but if you look at Northern Amarillo, when you get to a more urban area and also more diverse area, it's about a third of the population speaks a language other than English at home. And then there you see that not only is Spanish very common, but also Asian languages. And that can be indicative of the refugee population in the Amarillo metroplex. And the refugee population comes from a variety of countries, including, of course, Asian countries. So now let's actually get into the textbook. So Baker, the first chapter has a lot to do with definitions of bilingualism and conceptions of bilingualism. And so we're going to address all of these because they'll be a good background knowledge for what we're going to learn later in the chapters and in our course. Okay, so with Baker and his definitions, you can see that they first start with individual bilingualism versus societal bilingualism. And so that just shows you the different conceptions. So if you're looking at, obviously, the individual focus, the individual in mind, the individual student, you're looking at their individual bilingualism. And then societal bilingualism is looking at trends in bilingualism across communities. Language ability, that is how we're going to define how someone's proficiency or competency in a language is, their level. And so we talk about their abilities based on the 4 different domains of language, which are reading, writing, listening, and speaking. All right. Then the next definition is about language use. So we're going to consider how people use language, what contexts and what situations does a person communicate, and in what language. Also, we consider the type of language they'll use. So casual versus academic language, for example. Next, we look at ability. So for productive competence, that means that if someone is bilingual and can learn well in both languages, but not only learn both languages, but they can actually produce an output. They can make an original thought conveyed through communication. So they can, in this way, we define it as speaking and writing, right? Because when you speak and when you write, unless you're just literally repeating what has already been spoken or written, in general, that person is creating some kind of original thought or original concept that they're conveying to other people. Then they talk about passive bilingualism with receptive ability. So it's just like a passive person by nature. A passive means you're not actively doing things. And so a passive bilingual is someone who can pick up the language, can understand it a little bit, can read, in that language, but they can't really communicate their own original thoughts in that language. They revert back to English or to uh, whatever language is the dominant language that they are used to speaking in. Domains of language. So we talked about the different domains in terms of telepath, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, but also domains can also mean in terms of the setting, like the situation where the language is used. Often we use the word context of language. Another thing to notice is that the term dominance in a language. So dominance is just like the word sounds. It's one stronger than the other, and so that's in this case of language. It's when one language has a stronger capacity, and a person has a stronger capacity in one language than in another, their second language or third language or what have you. It's their stronger language. Next, they also define there's different stages or types of bilinguals. So you have infant bilinguals or infant bilingualism or simultaneous bilingualism, and that is when people are learning two languages, but they've learned it from birth. Often they have one caregiver that speaks only one language and the other caregiver speaks another language. And then those people continue to learn both languages all the way up to adulthood. So that's infant bilingualism. And then consecutive or sequential bilingualism is a sequence in the sense that your first language is your home language that you learn from your parents. And then after about the age of 3 or whenever you start formal schooling, that's when you learn your second language. So it could be at the age of 3 or it could be later in high school, for example. So most people in the United States are sequential bilinguals. They learn their home language at home, and then in school they learn English. And so those are people who are English language learners. But then if you are a native English speaker, same thing. You're learning English at home, but then maybe you learn your second language in the school setting as a foreign language. Then they talk about the stages of bilingualism, or the levels of bilingualism, if you will. And as an incipient bilingual is someone who's developed their first language very well, but they're just beginning to learn a second language. These are people that are just learning how to communicate, do introductions in a second language, maybe say some basic common phrases that are useful for maybe being a tourist or just just being able to navigate where is the bathroom, where order food in another language. But those are incipient bilinguals. And then ascendant bilingualism is the concept where your first language is well developed, and then your second language is developing rapidly and at an impressive rate, and it continues to do so. The opposite is recessive bilingualism. This is when someone's second language that they learn, they're often people who are learning the dominant language, that's their second language. So let's say an English language learner, if you will. Some English language learners, unfortunately, develop English very well, their second language, but then their ability to speak in their first language becomes somewhat recessive. It becomes diminished. So they end up shifting toward speaking only English or only reading and communicating in English. And so that can be an unfortunate phenomenon for people, because not only are they losing that benefit of being able to communicate in both languages, I mean, there's obviously economic benefits of communicating across the world and internationally, but also the cultural benefits of language. Arguably, those people are losing important cultural connections to their heritage by, unfortunately, having a recessive ability in their first language, their native language, their traditional language. Okay. A next point that Baker points out is that culture and language are different. They often someone can learn more about culture through language, and language is a demonstration in many ways of a culture, and culture influences language, but just learning a language does not necessarily mean you're learning the culture. And so Baker points out that especially like in elite prep schools or whatever, where people do become pretty fluent in a second language, they're not necessarily becoming fluent in that culture. So if you actually, when they go study abroad or when they end up moving to those other countries, they still have some issues communicating because they do not totally understand the culture, the traditions, and the idiomatic, the expressions that are unique to that language. And then there's the idea of bicultural competence, which is the idea. The ideal would be to be both bilingual, where you speak both languages, and also biculturally competent. And that's where you can navigate across cultures. You understand the history, traditions, and you can behave in an appropriate way regardless of the situation in those both, using both languages and in both cultural contexts. So there's different types of contexts in which language is learned. An endogenous context would be a bilingual community that is very established. There's a significant number of people who are speaking that language, and that you can hear both languages spoken, or more than one language spoken in the community. And so this is obviously a positive situation for many bilinguals, because in this way they can assure they're preserving their native language while also being able to learn the dominant language and the academic language of English. Now, an exogenous context is kind of somewhat of a negative situation for bilinguals, in the sense that this would be like if you're living in a small town, or just you're a very small minority language in a region. You have few people who actually use the language, few opportunities to interact with people in your native language, and few signs that are written in that language, little literature or music or television in that language. And so often, unfortunately, this can be a subtractive context. So subtractive context is just like, math terms. You get smaller. So unfortunately, if few people are speaking the language and you're getting very little exposure to your native language, often, not always, but sometimes, this can be a subtractive context in which your native language actually diminishes and becomes, you become fully, pretty much completely dominant, and also you only focus on using your English. Then they have a few more different definitions of bilingualism. So you have elective bilingualism, and this is what a vast majority of American students do, in terms of they choose their foreign language they want to learn, and it's a choice. They can always opt out or choose something else. And so these are people who have the option, and who have the ability to decide whether or not they want to learn another language and which one. The opposite would be circumstantial bilinguals. And circumstantial bilingualism is what most English language learners and most immigrants face in the United States. So a circumstantial bilingual is someone that ends up becoming bilingual just out of necessity. So these are people that need to learn the second language, the dominant language in a society, for business, for professional work, for academics if they want to pursue an education in that country. So these are people that are almost compelled, if they want to be citizens that fully participate, or residents that fully participate and have the equal economic and legal benefits as others. They feel obligated almost to learn the dominant language, because if they just stuck to only their native language, they would be very isolated and it would have limited opportunities. In this context, the circumstantial bilingualism, it can be recessive depending on the age of the person, because theoretically, if you're a young immigrant to the United States, let's say you come to the United States at 10 or something, and you feel obligated to learn English, you might eventually lose your ability to speak your native language. And out of circumstance and out of obligation to better yourself, you're learning English. But unfortunately, it can be a subtractive situation that your first language ends up decreasing, and your proficiency of your first language is lowered. So talking about functional bilingualism, those are the contexts and purposes that individuals use both languages. Um, so, talking about functional bilingualism, there's two aspects. You have language targets and you have language contexts and domains. So, language targets are the people with whom you communicate. So, that could be family, friends, professors, what have you. The language contexts are the situations where you use language. For example, do you use it at your work? Do you use which language do you use when you go shopping? Which language do you use when you're listening to TV? Or which language do you listen to TV in? So the context is the situations. I'm giving you an example of my own context. So like I said, I'm bilingual in English and Spanish. So first I started with my use of English. And so I first listed my language targets and my language contexts. So for my language targets, I use English with my family, my parents, my American friends, my neighbors, because I live in a primarily English-speaking neighborhood. I use it for business in terms of my real estate agent or with people who help provide customer service at the bank or what have you. And also when I'm doing government transactions, when I'm communicating with police officers or secretaries or lawyers, whoever, if I have to do that, I'm doing that in English. And then with my coworkers and my boss, I'm also primarily in the U.S. university academic setting using English. So those are my language targets, the people who I communicate with. Then next is the language context. And this chart is not meant to go from left to right. It's just meant to go from up to down. And by that, I mean that the language target in this chart does not have to link to the language context that's on the same line. So look at number 2, like American friends. So my language target's American friends, but my purpose for communicating with my friends is not for shopping. Or same thing with number 6, customer service agents. My purpose for communicating with customer service agents is not so I can read the newspaper. Okay, so language targets are its own category, language contexts are its own category. They can interrelate, but just the position in this chart does not have to be left to right correspondence. So going into language context, this is the situations I use language. So socially, shopping. So I use English primarily for social purposes, for academic purposes, work purposes. When I do my research, I'm still dominant in my first language, English, so I do my research in English. I write primarily in English for my academic papers. And so I listen to TV primarily in English because it's just easier and I'm used to the American culture and American TV shows and everything like that. Let's switch now to Spanish. So I'm also fully, in my opinion, bilingual in Spanish. I'm proficient. I can communicate well, and I don't have trouble with communication. So if you look at my language targets, it's a little interesting. So my girlfriend is a bilingual person, but she is also an English language learner. She came to the United States about 6 years ago, and she learned English, and she still is learning English and improving in English. She's an ascendant bilingual. Her bilingualism is improving daily, and I'm very proud of her for that. In the beginning, we primarily communicated in Spanish, but we still communicate in Spanish often. I would say about 50-50. So I included that as part of my language target. My girlfriend's parents are passive bilinguals. They can understand some English, but when we communicate, it's all in Spanish. I have friends still from Ecuador and from other countries that I've met along the way, and so when we're just socially hanging out, I communicate often with them in Spanish. If I go to Latina or Latino neighborhoods and I'm going to stores that I see the vast majority of people are communicating in Spanish, I often will communicate with storekeepers or customer service agents in Spanish. And then for people I know who are bilingual, like bilingual coworkers or the parents of my former students that contact me and ask me for advice for their children or just want to stay in touch, we communicate in Spanish because they are new. In general, they are pretty new to recent immigrants, and their dominant language is still Spanish. Uh, and then also with contractors, kind of for business purposes, when I've remodeled a couple houses and made contacts with some contractors, and then we primarily communicate in Spanish. So let's look at the language context, my purposes for using Spanish. So I use it for social, communicating with my girlfriend and her parents, shopping at Latino stores, teaching or work in terms of communicating with bilingual parents. I like watching movies in Spanish. And music, I listen to, I would say, about equal amounts of music in English and in Spanish. And so for audio media purposes, I use Spanish a lot when I'm passively listening to music. And like I said, business purposes in terms of remodeling my houses, I've used Spanish for that. Okay. This activity we're going to skip. I did it with another class, but since we're all online, we don't really need to do this right this second. We're going to kind of do it more on the discussion board, so let's just skip that. Let's go into the different language abilities. So once again, there's 4 language domains, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with telepass. There's listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And it's kind of, you can't really see it. It doesn't perfectly line up. But basically, going back to receptive and productive skills. Receptive is, once again, receiving or passively getting the information. And then productive skills is when you're physically producing new and original thoughts or ideas and communicating them to others. So in literacy, excuse me, I guess you can't, this is mixed up, I'm sorry about that. But oracy is actually oral language, so it doesn't correspond with this chart very well. But oracy is actually listening and speaking. And then literacy is the reading and writing. And I'm sorry, I'll try to correct that in the future. Then within each domain, there's skills within skills, right? So when you're speaking, you have to think about pronunciation, you have to think about your vocabulary you have, the grammatical structure, whether you're talking in complete sentences, or if you're using the appropriate syntax, like subject, verb, then object. That's normally how our English language flows. But, Yoda talks differently, like, dangerous he is. In that case, Yoda uses the object first instead of the subject. But that's unusual. But so the point is that for all fluent and effective communicators besides Yoda, the speakers have a good grasp of English syntax, subject, verb, object. Also, to be able to be an effective speaker in the cultural context, you also have to have an idea of idiomatic phrases. So idiomatic phrases, it's spelled IDIO, but it's not like an idiot, but idiomatic. An idiom, it comes from the word idiom. An idiom is basically a phrase that's unique to a particular language and culture. And so an idiomatic phrase in the United States might be like, you can attract more flies with honey than with vinegar. Or the straw that broke somebody's back. I forgot what it was. I think who knows what it was. Do not put all your eggs in one basket or something like that. They're phrases that if you are learning a language, you might be very confused because they're symbolic and they're conceptual, and they're not a literal translation, right? When you say you can attract more flies with honey than in vinegar, you're talking about how being positive and being kind to others will help you make more friends and kind of convince people to see your way. It's not literally talking about people who are looking for trying to find flies and wanting to have pet flies. So that was an idiomatic phrase. So we've kind of had a long lecture, so we're going to stop after this. But I just wanted to talk about this because this will be very useful for your first discussion board and your first assignment. And so this is the Valdez continuum. And this is the theory that basically bilingualism is not, it's kind of like what we learned earlier. It's a process, and it's not just all or nothing. And it doesn't happen instantly, and it develops over time. And so this is just kind of like a visual of demonstrating it. And the continuum is like there's a range of your ability to speak languages. And so it takes, normally you pick your two, I guess, top or most fluent languages. So, or whatever two languages you're comparing the abilities. So for me, I picked English and Spanish. And so the capital letter stands for when you are fluent and you're productive in that language. The lowercase level is when you have kind of like just the beginning incipient stage where you're just barely learning the language, or you're developing it still. You're not, I would not say completely fluent. You cannot converse with adults meaningfully or in academic settings meaningfully. So that would be the lowercase level, the incipient level, the still developing the abilities. So I picked my two languages as English and Spanish. And then I also broke it down like a timeline of my life. So if you look from age 0 to 7, although my first language was English, and I would say I was a pretty smart kid, so my English ability was pretty good. But I was still, I would say, in the incipient or developing, ascending stages of English. I couldn't communicate completely effectively with adults. I was still learning the grammatical structure of the language, and especially how to read and write in the language effectively. And I was still building my vocabulary, my academic vocabulary especially. And so that's why I put a lowercase e. I would say I'm still developing. I wasn't completely fluent in English. And then around age 7 to 13, that's when I really, I developed important academic vocabulary that was, I would say, close to high school or college level, and close in enough vocabulary to communicate effectively with adults and in many situations in the everyday world. And also my grasp of verbs and grammar and syntax, sentence structure was all pretty well developed. So at that age, I considered myself fluent in English. So I had a capital E. But if you notice, from both of those years, from 0 to 13, I had very little exposure to Spanish. My dad taught me a few phrases, or, one vacation, I tried to learn Spanish through a tape, back when they had tapes, cassettes, through a tape while driving on a long road trip. But I didn't really, I maybe knew a few words like hola, or how to count, or some colors, but I would not even say incipient in that language. If I had to say I needed to go to the bathroom, if I had to order in a restaurant, or I had to just do the very basic communication in Spanish, I couldn't do that. Starting in age 14, that's when I started to not only continue to develop my English ability. I would say I was completely fluent in English, but I also was even improving even more on my writing and reading abilities, my reading comprehension. Then at that time, I started taking foreign languages in my high school in Spanish. And so that's why I put the lowercase s, because my Spanish was incipient, it was beginning, and it was developing. It was ascendant in that it was increasing in nature. Every day I was learning something in Spanish, but I certainly was not fluent. So then around age 20 through 21, even though I had continued to learn Spanish throughout high school and in college, I never basically took a semester off. I wouldn't say I fully became fluent in Spanish until I studied abroad for a year in Ecuador. And even then, the very first month or two, I was still in the developing stages, the incipient stages, I would say, in terms of communication. I could read and write pretty well in Spanish because a lot of my academic courses, especially in college, had made me write and read college level literature in that language, but my speaking and listening abilities were still pretty incipient. But then after about third month, fourth month, when I just basically got only exposed to Spanish almost all day. The only time I spoke English was with my parents. All my friends spoke only to me in Spanish. Um, all my classes were in Spanish in college. The home I stayed in, I stayed at a host family. They only spoke to me in Spanish. Basically, almost, and I would listen to music only in Spanish and read only in Spanish. And so I would say about 90% of the language that I used in Ecuador was Spanish. And so eventually, I would say I became fully fluent and bilingual in Spanish. So then around age 22 and 20 to 25, that's when I graduated and I started teaching. But in my first school I taught at, and especially under certain principals, the principals they kind of had the mentality of all English. And later we're going to learn that mentality has been shown by research to be not as effective. But their concept of ESL or bilingual education, which is the more English, the better. And so during those years, most of my friends were native English speakers. And most of the time in the classroom, I was speaking English. I would speak Spanish to parents, and I would write letters to parents in Spanish. And I had some friends that were Spanish speakers, and I communicate them with Spanish. But for the most of my time, I spent talking in English. And so I would even say my Spanish ability kind of declined a little bit. It was a recessive situation, a subtractive context in the sense that my abilities in Spanish actually declined. But then around age 25, my third or fourth year of teaching, the principals of the school, their mindset changed, and also the school district's policy on bilingualism changed, and my grade changed as well. So I started teaching second grade, and so second grade had a lot more, almost 50-50 of English and Spanish. And so I was reading to my students literature in Spanish, I was writing in Spanish, we were communicating mostly in Spanish. And so I would say my Spanish grew partially for that reason. And then also in my personal life, that's when I met my current girlfriend. And then, like I said in the beginning, we primarily communicated in Spanish because she was a new immigrant from Mexico. But then, of course, now it's about 50-50. But I would say basically from that age 25, I kind of turned back towards Spanish. And so now I'm saying completely fluent in both languages, and I hope I'll stay that way. So we're going to stop here, and then I'll post the rest for next week. Thank you very much for listening and for your patience. I appreciate it. I hope this is helpful. Please give me feedback if this is helpful, because it did take an hour to write or more, or an hour to narrate. And so if you guys aren't really using it, then please let me know. And that way I can save my time, and you won't have to listen to this PowerPoint or whatever. Okay? So thank you. I won't be offended. It's just I'm trying to learn what's best and most effective for our class. So thank you.